with a consideration of the Palermo Stone Royal Annals. Royal Annals basically have 120-year blocks in each register. Register we're interested in today is the Recto 2, second register, and that's on the Royal Annals. Okay, this particular register has a record of three separate rulers, three different rulers. The recognition that there are three of these rulers is dependent upon the order in which you see the Palermo stone and the Cairo fragment, London fragment, etc., minor fragments, organised over a grid of 8 rows of 120 year cells. So, Cut has looked at the issue and made certain sort of decisions as to how they see things panning out. A lot of this is based on the work of Borchardt, his basic effort to resolve the second register. So I will proceed. One of the kings that projects as being part of this second register is Jet or Athothus I. Another king is Jur or Mies, and another king is Nama. Now, we know something about Athothus I from Africanus. He gives 57 years for Athothus I. We know that from Wilkinson, with his archaeological analysis of second register, that there are at least 41, and that looks pretty accurate, 41 cells which apply to a king he calls Jur. And, okay, already identified that. In Manetho, by the way, Jur has, or at least in Eratosthenes, but possibly in Manetho, has 62 years. So that, just keep that in mind. Now, adding those two together, you get 98 cells. So, from this end, remember, we read right to left. But in our case, we're flexible. So, from starting at this end and going to here, we have a total of 98 cells. If we look at the 120 and the 98, we see that there's a 22 cell gap. Okay, Cut places Nama at 2976 to 2906. And since we've already named him as the first king, we would expect 2906 minus 22 would be the start year for this Nama. Now, Nama has been ruling for a lot longer, but he only kicked in at 2928. And you have to ask the question, well, why is that so? Well, if we come along here and look at Cut's analysis of the early kings, the patriarchs, etc., which are set out in Waddell's Manetho, and based on a flood date of 3326 or 2726, Horus the ruler, when placed in order, comes out as starting a reign in 2928. Actually, Horus the ruler is 2923, but when you analyse it, his actually start year is 2928. So that means that as a king and ruler, Horus kicks in coincidentally or whatever at the same time as Nama is indicated to have started a rule in the Palermo stone, if we at Cut have analysed things correctly. So we've got a Cut chronology deduction for this first king. Okay, that takes us clearly, to 2906. So you've got 2928 to 2906. Right. Next thing, Menes. Menes in the Palermo-Stan record has a starting entry with 4th month, 13th day. Now, since I've already indicated that Menes has 62 years of rule, then what we have to presume is that Menes has only had a part of his reign recorded. Now, one thing as a researcher I found is that there's a possible connection between when a king's archaeological record is looked at and it starts with a X month, Y day. Usually it means that you're starting somewhere within the 70-year period that that king had for rule. And that's a cut convention. So, by using the concept of drift dating, which is set out in M. Christine Tetley's thesis, her Doctor of Divinity thesis, the post-flood date, the year after the flood, plus this 4th month, 13th day drifted, will drift you to 2914. In other words, this person is saying, look, I'm starting my reign 412 years post the flood. Okay. Now, we get down to the end of this 41 years, and just by mathematics, you end up with 2873. Okay. As a little interlude before we get on to Athethis, what we might have a look at is this little line down here where we've got Menes, and we've got a blue line down there, and we've got from Africanus, a little blue line going to an asterisk. Well, what we're really suggesting here is that the end of Jur here is actually the final year of his reign. In other words, as far as his lifetime is concerned, and apparently it was done in by a hippopotamus. So he didn't make it to 70 years, and that's the key to the next one of these presentations that we give. But anyway, in this case, 2873 with 62 years up to the hippopotamus. If you go back in time, you come to 2935, minus 2935. So you can say, well, all right, Jur has started his reign somewhat earlier than the 2914. In actual fact, 2935. Now, if we go and have a look at 2935, this is, of course, when using Barry Setterfield's conversion facility, you find that the Chicxulub asteroid crashed into the Earth that year, 2935, and it made a mess worldwide. Antarctica all the way up to Alaska, everywhere. Ethiopia, the lot. So it was like a second sort of flood, like a sort of a mini flood, or not a big flood. Anyway, that, as the studies that Cut has made into the actual modern way of describing an interval of time, which is a start date and an end date, then that actually corresponds to the beginning of the First Dynasty. And Cut says 2935 to 2682 is the First Dynasty, 2682 to 2380 is the Second Dynasty. And these are obviously 253 years and 302 years. You can do all the maths, that works out. Anyway, the next guy is not an archaeological entry. This is just taken straight from Africanus, okay? And everything depends here upon the association of Jet and Athethis. If you don't make that connection, well, sorry about that. But 57 years runs down to 120 years. All cells now are accounted for. Athethis has that period of time. But there's just one he starts his reign at 2874 to 2817. So that is a little bit of an interesting 4-3. Ooh, that makes a bit of a difference. Anyway, what we will do in the next one of these presentations is we will go into depth to explain that, because it does help highlight the concept that we're also introducing, as well as 70 years, and as well as sort of going back to the patriarchs, and as well as sort of taking in archaeology. It allows us to introduce a very interesting aspect of reigns of Egyptian kings, and that is that if they didn't make a full 70 years of rule, someone, a peer or a relative or somebody, will complete out in loco rex, in place of the king, that last few years or however many years until a 70-year point is reached. So we've called that peer to complete, or in loco rex, in place of the king. Okay, that covers basically the introductory portion of these two, the first of these two presentations we're going to be making, that will really bring the whole video that we've been making to an end. Okay, the question is, to follow on then, the Eratosthenes and Africanus assigned Menes 62 years. What happened to the missing 8 years? Keep in mind the underlying assumption of the clearing up times or cut chronology is 70 years for the rule of a king. The 61 for Menes, the 62 for Menes starts 2935. There's a 30-year period, and then there's a one year long set period. And so that's not just a festival, it's a 1 year period. And from year 32 down to year 61 represents a second 30-year period of rule, and at the end of that second 30 years is again a 1 year long period in which a set festival is celebrated. The numbers that Africanus gives us for Menes is 62, and we've got 60 from another source. The 62 of Africanus is backed up by the 62 of Eratosthenes. So we've got two separate reports which both give 62 years for this particular king. Now, we have a connection made by Syncellus, George the monk, Syncellus. He actually assigns the identity of Mizraim, of the scriptures, with Menes. And we've already associated Menes with the Egyptian identifier Jur. So, the commencement of the reign of Mizraim, in this particular instance, starts at 2874, ends at 2874, but commences 35 years earlier. So we can deal with that. 2909 minus 2874 gives us 35 years. Alright. 2874 was the date we assigned to Athothus, the commencement of Athothus in our previous presentation. So that 2874 was explained as the commencement of the rule of Athothus' period of 70 years. Right. The 2935 to minus 2873, just as we mentioned that there was a 2873 involved in the previous presentation, we have to give some kind of explanation as to where that 2873 came from. Alright, 2873, you can see if you subtract 62 will bring you to 2935, and we've already identified 2935 as Chicxulub asteroid hit, which was a massive asteroid hit. Massive. And the reason it was so massive was simply that the Earth's magnetic field, due to a geodynamo slowdown in the previous number of years, 40 years, actually had, 30 years, I'm sorry, actually had weakened the magnetosphere and allowed the impact of the asteroid to be much greater, because it was not slowed down, it was travelling very fast because of the lack of the shield, and hit the Earth with a tremendous thud. Okay, now 2909. Alright, that's the start of Mizraim, or Menes, and we can see that there will be 1, 2, 3, 4 years into that first period, so it will be really year 26 of Menes' complete rule. Alright, 2909, when we look at that, we have to say, is that, or can we confirm what that 2909 really means? What's 2909 in the scheme of things? Alright, Peter Lundström from Faro.se in Sweden has calculated that the number of years to year 5 in the reign of a third dynasty king called Concharis is reported as 700 in Weddell's Manetho, in the records that he brings out there. But because there are included lacunae, Peter Lundström has been able to determine the length of that total space of lacunae to be 68 years. So in other words, in sort of Greek terms, sort of mathematical terms, you're looking at a difference of 768 years from Menes, which is what the record of Manetho says, to this year 5 of Concharis. Alright, we can all do maths. Minus 2171 minus 2909 equals 768 years. Alright, okay. So we end up with minus 2171 as being year 5 of Concharis. Now, how do we know that any of this, this is all a bit airy-fairy at this point? Well, we can anchor that year 5 by considering the pattern of Tanite kings. In other words, there's a list, if you go to Manetho, Weddell's Manetho, you will see a list in the Book of Sothis of what are essentially Tanite kings. They start with a character called Sesonkosis, and Sesonkosis is a Grecized version of an Egyptian name, I call it that, Kasekum. So what we're looking at here is a number of kings in the first 25 list of kings there. You will see Sesonkosis, and those kings running down from Sesonkosis can be paralleled to an unpublished chronology called Clearing Up Time's Chronology. Exactly. We can look at the names of kings in the Tanite list, and we can directly track across on our spreadsheet rows and discover that king after king after king after king after king, the actual rows correspond from Tanite start to Memphis start. So we can actually prove very conclusively that Concharis did, from chronological considerations, commence his reign in 2171. Alright, okay, so on the evidence of Manetho, the data from Manetho, we can establish 2909 for Mizraim. Okay, having established that, having established 2874 and coming back to 2935, we are in a pretty good position to say that the entire reign of Menes ran from minus 2935 to minus 2865. That's a 70-year period. Okay. Now, in the reign of the succeeding king to Menes, right, he's a king that got started, as we've just pointed out, in 2874. That king has, by the connection, the archaeological connection with Jet, Athothus I has a record of commencing a rule at the start of his archaeological record in a month and day which adds up to 232 days. Now, we can all work that out, 30 into that goes 7, and then you've got 22, so it's the 8th month and the 22nd day. But that all reduces back to 232 days multiplied by 4 for drift purposes. We get 928. 928, and we've got to look for a benchmark, and the typical benchmark of these early kings was, frighteningly as it may seem, patriarchal. Noah's birth. That was remembered long in time, right down to the very foundation of Egyptian dynastic life. So, that yields to us a date 2833. Aha! Now, 2833 is really, really very significant, and we will deal with that in the next one of these presentations. What it needs, before we can go to that next presentation, we need to just pin down something that is not, it's only by report, so we just have to take it as valid unless somebody can prove otherwise. The first year of Athothus I, 2874, the last year, the 59th year, which comes from Eratosthenes, 59, not the 57 of Manetho, which of course gave us our other figure on the previous presentation. Year 59 turns out to be minus 2815, and that is something that we need to understand. That came about because, according to Plutarch, he was murdered. Alright, okay, so that means that now we've got one king short of his time, 2874 to 2864, 10 years, and the succeeding king is also out short of his time, but he's short by 11 years. 11 plus 59 is 70. So, just to tidy this up before we go on and pursue this actual drift date that we have, and also the death and what happened to the end of Athothus, we will just mark and note that the demigod Anubis started to reign in 2875. Now, that accounts for a 60-year rule of Menes, and one has to wonder whether Anubis usurped some of Menes' power towards the end of his reign, and so the last couple of years he was under sort of like a co-rule or some certain amount of usurpation by Anubis. All right, we'll get on to the next one of these presentations now. What is the evidence for Athethys I's in loco rex for Menes? Athethys is followed by Den. And we say that because we associate Jet with Athethys. If we take a record of the seal impressions from el-Kab with king lists of the first dynasty, have two varying king lists, one which puts Merit-Neat before Den, following Athethys, and the other one puts Den, following Athethys. Typically, we would say Merit-Neat has actually been regent to Den during a certain period of Den's early life. And that explains the two different inscriptions. The list is Jet, Den, and Egypt, etc. So from various sealings, we know that relationship. Den is represented or enters into the Manathonic lists as an entity called Eusaphes. And Eusaphes has a 20-year period which follows Kenkens. And Kenkens is, in actual fact, Ita. What we would like to point out is that in cut chronology, Kenkens in 70 years in 2778, and Eusaphes in Manetho is given 20 years. He ends that 20 years in 2758. Now, 2758 is in fact the last of Arphaxad, the biblical patriarch, as 430-year lifespan following the birth of his successor at 35 years of age. Arphaxad is also associated by a cut on the basis of page 235 in Manetho, in which, in speaking of various kings in the Sothic list, it introduces two biblical characters, Arphaxad and Peleg. Aristarchos is one of the kings in that list, which is being qualified and positioned chronologically by reference to Arphaxad. Aristarchos is really a name for Arphaxad, and he ruled from 2792 to 2758, 34 years according to the Sothic record, Syncellus, and in actual fact, the end of his reign is exactly the same as the end of the reign of Arphaxad, as we have set it out, and that means that Den, in actual fact, was a parallel ruler to Arphaxad for the last 20 years of Arphaxad or Aristocrus' rule. Now, the other character mentioned in Manetho, in Sothis, is Peleg. Jewish tradition says, post 80 years, he started to rule. He starts a rule 2763. Now, we would immediately want to see that the relationship expressed in Manetho, 34 for Arphaxad, 5 for Peleg, is properly reflected in our chronological schema. And we see that 2763 for Peleg is in fact 5 years following 2758. Now, Peleg is in scripture a brother to Joktan, and Joktan had 13 sons, one of which was Jobab or Job. Now, when we look at Shem, we see that Shem's life was 3420 approximately to 2825, certainly. Jobab or Job starts to rule from the end of Shem's life. When Shem dies, Jobab, or as we have identified him, Euanephes, in the Manathonic record, he has a start date then. We don't know when he ends, because we know the story of Job. Once he gets off his ash heap, he has another 140 years of life. So we're not sure how old he was when all that started. So he certainly had a long life. In clearing up times, we have two numbers, 23 and 42, as the length of regnal counts that are associated by the different authors, Eusebius and Africanus, to Euanephes. Now, clearly that's just reading the Manetho's record, and one looks at it one way, one looks at it another way, so you get two different numbers. That's okay, there's plenty of data in Manetho that these guys had to work with, not a problem. Okay, the 23 years, as we look at things, starts at 2815, plus 23 gives you 2792. Oh, right. In other words, one of the regnal counts that you could apply to Euanephes corresponds to the last year of Athothus, 1, when he was murdered, 2, 2792, the rise to power in Egypt. Egypt, remember all this stuff about 40,000 years and 12,000 years and blah blah blah, all that nonsense. This is the truth. He starts a rule in 2792. So in other words, really, Job or Euanephes only ruled down until Arphaxad took up power. In that regnal count, that view. Now there's a second view. In other words, Eusebius looks at this and says 42 years, right? Okay. 2805 or 54, however you want to look at it, because there are months and days involved at the end of a king's reign, is actually the full end of Athothus' 70 years. So this other view of Jobab or Euanephes' rule is that he waited until the the formal end of Athothus I's reign before he took up another regnal count. And that regnal count was 42 years, and that ended 2763. Now, if we look across to these patriarchs mentioned in Manetho, you see that Cut has assigned 2763 to the start of Peleg's reign. So this second number, 42, is now the actual end of where you would expect 70 years to end for Athothus, and the start of Peleg's reign. Remember, 5 years connected. So those two numbers, 23 and 42, really define the start of an in loco rex and the end of an in loco rex. The King Den was a son of Merit-Neith. Now, Merit-Neith ends her time as a consort or a wife to her husband Jet in 2763. Now, we've already met that. That is 2763 here, Peleg. So it's fairly clear that Merit-Neith is in the line, the patriarchal line, and Peleg refrains from taking up power until her 70 years is completed. Now, if you add 70 onto 2763 in the sense of going backwards in time, which mathematically is subtracting it, but you come to 2833. Now, I've already met 2833 in the previous board. That is a time which we can connect back to the birth of Noah. Noah here, remember, dies or is ill for a number of years, 6 years, 2983 to 2977, and I think that is a Talmudic tradition, but I'm not 100% sure where that comes from. It is traditional information. So Cut has assigned that last 6 years to the years 2983 to 2977. Already we know Nama, we said Nama starts 2976, so if there was a month and days at the end of that, what that shows is Nama, whom we can demonstrate had 70 years, in actual fact was the first king to dynastically sort of, follow along a 70-year pattern. Not a problem. Because Merit-Neith starts her reign 2833, which we've already associated with Athothus's non-conventional sort of start. In other words, 10 years late start to his 70 years, to his rule, which would give him only 60. Then, or thereabouts, then it's quite likely that young Den, little tyke, would have been born probably in 2833, at least a year, plus or minus a year. That's a tradition that is very common. Children are often born at a set season to rulers, which is probably strange in our terms, but it does happen, did happen. The appearance of Merit-Neith before Den and these inscriptions from Kab is probably best explained by simply saying that by the time 2815 that Athothus I is murdered, young Den, he's a bit young. He's not fully up to being a king at that point. So it's quite likely, and it's almost proved, that Merit-Neith did stand in for him for a number of years until he achieved his majority. So what it's looking like now is that 2815 to 2805 is certainly demonstrated to be a period where Merit-Neith, acting as a regent for the young bloke, Den, took up power and ruled out Athothus I's in loco rex, and that at the same time, Euanephes, who we associate with Kut, a son of Peleg's brother, Joktan, actually supported her or backed her up during this in loco rex. Alright, having established that in loco rex, then for Athethys, how do we get back to Menes? Alright, what we've got here is 28 to 15 and 57, or 59 actually, is 74. Right, so our 59 years then for Athethys starts at the end of Menes' 70 years. Merit-Neith and her intervention or her in loco rex for her husband Jep, who's a young son, that's the next in line, demonstrates that Athethys I started his reign as a personal reign. In other words, his time, not serving in loco rex, but serving as a king himself, commenced at a period of time, 2833, which, if you subtract 31 years, as we've got here, gives you 2864. Okay, 2864. So you could sort of talk in funny terms by saying, okay, this guy ruled 2865 or 2864, whether you've got months and days floating around there, as the full reign of Jet. Yet we know he actually had 70 years, and that initial 70 years is actually not accounted for as far as we've explained so far. Therefore, we assert that there's sufficient evidence for us to say that Athethys I definitely had a period of time where he served in place of Menes, his father. The other interesting things here that we could see is that Spanios is Hispanus, a grandson of Hercules, identified by Dr. Herman Hay as Seir the Horite. And the other final thing is that, this Job thing is just the silliest thing you could imagine. This manual for kingship shows the source name which was applied to Edom's descendant. That's really developed, we've really developed and shown absolutely that the patriarchal system extended and was active in Egypt for a really long period of time, that it was still, there were still biblical characters, if not particularly in that line, active in Egypt for a long time. And we can even jump to Joseph and see in the records that Joseph 2018, as he started his famine, plenty and famine, that period, if you subtract 259, you come to 2277, which is in actual fact the beginning of Dynasty 15, the Hyksos people. So there's a lot of interconnection here, an awful lot of interconnection. And we can say the true origin of Egyptian